Sente qualcosa? Sì, si sente qualcosa. Bene. Allora, riprendiamo i nostri lavori con la sessione su rappresentanza e difesa degli interessi e cominciamo con Julie Claustre dell'Université Paris Cité, Espace des métiers et Espace économique, Paris, XIIIe-XVe siècle.
Oui, donc ma communication se focalise sur les rapports.
My communication has been focusing mostly on the urban economy in case of Paris. I want to start saying that one of the founders of the political regimen is above all pointing at the issue of crafts, a sort of pact or agreement between the bishop and the king, assigning the space. And this is going to start with the first article, which is the listing of all the craftsmen that were under the authority or the control of the bishopric, the bishop, for the distribution of guild space. At the beginning of the 12th century, there is a power organization absolutely key, and this control is made by urban rulers. I believe this issue of professional space is key. That's an issue that has been very much attractive to scholars. These are crafts, but in recent exceptions, in these exceptions also, we have some exceptions. We had an article of 2023, so
Jusqu'à très récemment,
then in 2025, recently enough, historiography of crafts is just focusing on more abstract issue and not on concrete space. That's a sort of abstract notion, monopoly, human capital, the political body, and the community organization. Historiography considers these crafts in one town, talking of local monopoly and taking part in local activities. And this is judged under different viewpoints, social and spiritual. But I also believe they have to consider also local professional spaces as homogeneous, whilst other systems have been established to regulate several activities to this extent. But in Paris, things are much more complicated. Economic spaces, urban spaces. That's a whole of lordships and economic jurisdictions. And this is not only in Paris, but this is also found in other French cities and towns. And I hope this is going to be the case for other European cities, but I would like to get additional information to this extent. However, in this dimension of professional space, which is my main reference. So earlier on, the scholars of guilds studied this, starting from the edition edited in the 19th century. These are a Parisian collection, very, very rich. And this is the most distinctive feature, along with other documents clarifying how the Parisian crafts work. So crafts under the authority of the king. Now we have the crafts that have been protected by other lords in Paris, above all the abbeys of the city. So the medieval abbey is the great, protector of Parisian guilds. So we have just a sort of relationship between these crafts under this authority and the crafts under the control of the king. But this has not been fully studied by the case of butchers. Whilst so the guilds of these gentlemen having wide competencies. Everything is under the crown in a scenario which is homogeneous. So I propose to make a comparison between several crafts which has been under the protection of the king, with the crafts protected by two big Parisian lordships in Paris. These two groups of the River Gauche. I want to find the right button to click on. Saint-Germain-des-Prés in the West Bank, and then Geneviève-Abbey, a territory which is in orange. For these, I'm going to take advantage of this charter, and I see the regulations of crafts being registered. So at the site of the king's representatives, and the crafts being represented by some lordships, unpublished so far. And then I want to use the registers of justice. I'm going to do this very short this afternoon. And since historiography has given some privilege to these regulations, so I'm going to speak of professional litigations, disputes, arguments, more exactly documenting the life of the professional organizations. This first approach is showing that according to the sector of activity concerned, the situation was quite different. There might be one single activity, the recognition of one single craft. For one single craft, also there might be the establishment of differentiated crafts according to the townscape. Also, there might be specific trades and crafts that might make it very difficult. I mean, any synthetic interpretation of this. So in the past and even today, I'm showing you the stuff in a very analytical way. First and foremost, I'm speaking of Saint-Geneviève and then Saint-Germain-des-Prés. I hope to be clear in the end, and I will draw some conclusions out of this long speech. So the district of Saint-Geneviève, we are on the river gauche of the river, eastbound. The Abbey of Saint-Geneviève adds a wide seigneurial, structure. Here we go. Now you see the Abbey now in this chart. And you see some space southeast bound. This is the right location. Well, now, so, let's go ahead with my slides now. So, at this abbey, we have these book with some regulation of these crafts. Madame Saint-Geneviève, at the end of the 13th century, the abbey has a good production of rules and provisions in line with the provisions made by the representative of the king. So that's a regulation which is very wide, a huge amount of provisions of law. We have different regulations, 23, with 20 activities. This means, just to give an order of magnitude, we have 5 less crafts registered in this area. In these 24 regulation for 20 crafts are quite an amount of. Some of these 24 regulations are just copying the rules of the royal crafts. Others recognize the authority of the abbot. And also some similarities with the king's regulation. So this means we have just a lot of solutions the differences so between the seigneurial crafts and the regal so royal crafts. Now I'm speaking of some cases. I'm not going to detail these cases. Also, we have the case of those being knife makers, so groups coming from several sectors, but all the other crafts are just the same ones, the same with the same wording. If we take the case of the locker makers, so that's a craft for lockers making in Saint-Geneviève. They were the same rules, the same regulation, but made in a different way. But the craft of lockers, this craft was something to pay for, whereas the other of the king of the crown was free. So the freeness of this craft in Saint-Geneviève has been an important element for developing this craft, because when we gave space to the lockers makers, so doing this, we have a small concentration on this map of those making locks. So that's a matter of nine makers of lockers. We have a small concentration also in the southwestern part of this area. The last case I want to elaborate on now, for reasons of time, I'm sorry, I'm going backwards. Okay, yeah, we go almost. So the last case is the one of those the belt makers, with different components, a craft which is very well specified in Saint-Geneviève, with some specific activities. That's the royal craft, which is prohibiting belt makers to make belts. So a sort of separation, quite crystal clear separation, quite quick now, what we have done, and also want to suggest that, as a matter of fact, there is a general scenario which has been provided so far as to the craft regulation by the king and in Saint-Geneviève. According to these activities, as I said, I want to speak of the regulation, but also with additional developments for, the justice, implementation, the right of enacting the law. But through this necessary documentation and judicial documentation, the power of appointing, condemning, convicting artisans, craftsmen, the power of to destroy merchandise which were not fit to standards. These are very, very concrete deeds. This made it possible to empower these crafts, also according to the size of the individual guild. The same Saint-Geneviève book comes back, and also have some, judicial deeds being documented, registered. And what's interesting is, since all these deeds are public deeds, confirm public value. But we have many additional examples. So this one, by chance, this is a merchandise, a commodity, which has been judged as unfit, invalid by some local manufacturers in Saint-Geneviève. Then you have the numbering, 26 crafted men, is listed here at the end of this text. And something else, the judiciary ceremony, they are typical of what's occurring in Paris at the end of this epoch. And now you see, don't you? You see the recovery. they are going to give back the abbot the jurisdiction on the craft. So this jurisdiction is given back to the abbot with something very interesting on these crafts. I'm very much interested by this, interested in this public ceremony. I also provide you with some explanatory examples, and in the right-hand side column of bar, I just listed several types of action which have been taken, and you have some confiscation, some seizure, and so we go back to the same craft jurisdiction. After that, the king's agents intervene on the activity of these artisans in Saint-Geneviève. There's the first case I just elucidated. That's a case is about the Saint-Geneviève craft. First, we have the abbé, which is very jealous of its crafts and trade, the abbé, which everything this entails for business making. And second point, also some additional difficulties to totally quantify these. The craft regulations does not suffice, and also some judiciary deeds have been a bit blurred. So Saint-Geneviève's documentation doesn't make it possible to confiscate, to do this. A second point shows the heterogeneity of the professional space, not only because the abbé or the abbot have their own crafts, but because under the crafts by the king and the crafts of the abbot, we have to make a distinction. Also for the regulation, everything starts quite difficult, blurred, and a bit vague. So we cannot, regulate everything as we would like to. Coming back to Saint-Germain-des-Prés, looking at the lands in light green on the left bank of the river, so Rive Gauche, and Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the documentary profile is this one. Is slightly different. So also you see where the abbey is located, and also I'm showing also additional spaces where, of course, the jurisdiction is valid for these crafts. This documentary profile is slightly different because the documentation, well, nowadays in Saint-Germain-des-Prés is very strictly judiciary, lot of regulations, rules, and going back to the 15th century. And so we have the registers of justice also recording the person in charge for this in the abbey. So we can study also professional litigation, dispute, and all the rest that follows. And once, as this very case, you see some auditors, inspectors of the trade, that come and draft a report before the judge of the abbot, the abbot's judge. But in other terms, conversely, that's the table, because I like tables a great deal. So I made this table where I tried to show you the variety of skills and competencies required for doing this. The judge's skills. In the abbey, there might be some malfunction in improper use of raw materials, with some judgments, ruling, some fines are required. We have to fine employees. Employees been fined by the abbot. All this has been timely reported. What you can see, this professional litigation dispute has been mentioned many, many times. And also you see everything this entails as a case of justice. I want to add, I see also this litigation, and I see a document which is very exact in detailing the situation, and I got through this document that's a survey, an investigation on the guild, on the craft. And we have someone making some pottery maker in Saint-Geneviève. You see the results obtained studying, getting through other documents, which keep on documenting the trial. So against this potter. And also we have the witness of the investigation. There was interrogation to the witnesses in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. We know how the party organizations runs, because the proxy of the king accused the potters, those making pottery, officially, but also conversely, these potter was also judged as in agreement with all these. So this investigation has been wanted intentionally by the abbé, by the abbots. So that's a matter of rules, regulations in favor of the potter. So what's occurring? So this is explain how you can just switch to the next step of this situation. And in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, we said the district of Saint-Germain-des-Prés is totally separated from Paris. First point. Second point, the abbey, with its abbot, exerts a deep control on all these activities, trades, and craft. So the regulation of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, cobblers, shoemakers, is specific, nothing to do with the regulation of Parisian shoemakers, cobblers. The same applies to potters. And also we have something else, been very interesting, eye-catching. This was a very rich document, but above all also we see some questions, very, very intelligent, asked as to the outcome of the research carried out already by the examiners, the auditors, the inspectors. The inspectors. So if you took part in the inspection of the workshop, this was a question. If you perform this inspection on a regular basis, for which craft is going to do this, in presence of whom, which kind of witnesses do you have, are the members of the craft or other witnesses? So if these inspections on the spot have been rejected, so stop, and one is give his or her own answer according to his or her own standing and craft or job. Another point I mentioned already, there is one point saying that his workshop has been visited also by these inspectors 30 times per year. So this investigation is very interesting, quite attention-grabbing. And one last element I want to elaborate on is the motivation of witnesses who expressing themselves during this investigation. Three most important motivations. First and foremost, the defense of commonly shared interests. The artists have been members also of different guilds, also having specific elements, one specific element. So, and Movie is very much interested in the stabilization of the publishers guild. He says some time ago he was a shoemaker in Paris under the authority of the kingdom, and then he left Paris. He moved eastbound, as other brothers of his did already, just to work peacefully, just to work the leather from Lausanne, which is a special leather which has been prohibited in Paris, downtown. So we have this local technique. So, I mean, so we leave these strands of the guild toward the choice of some different installation of workers. On the second element, we just find the strands proceeding this way. All witnesses rejected to answer these questions. They refuse to say. They do not answer the questions. They do not want to give an answer. They know if this potterman is valid, but anyone refuses to respond because they didn't know the word, they didn't know this craft, this job, no idea. And then we have additional motivation. Also, we have the symbol of symbolic expression of some responsible, solidarity, be responsible also of their families, households. They propose also to help with Marcel, which is just the mason or bricklayer for a couple of years has been working and has been running a Poitiers workshop, running this workshop in Poitiers for a couple of years. And this go ahead with the story of the attorney of the king. After this investigation, we see the variation from crafts, standardized crafts. I keep on talking quickly, going straight to my conclusions to draw now. So the Parisian situation as to the professional spaces shows a multiple group of multiple professions, some diversity of political situations according to individual activities carried out and envisaged. That's an element of uncertitude, because without saying, I want to evoke this for some economic stakeholders, this uncertainties are preserved. Above all, this condition, uncertainty, should be squeezed in this document I'm going to send you shortly. Also, we have the guild members been focusing on this special, expression that's also special economic reality not to neglect. On a small case, you can see the emergence of this, also looking at the several, trade facets, judiciary sources, political sources, on the establishment of this activity. And this is something that can further develop in the document. And everything is done in the street space, between the street and the workshop, a public area space where you see the existence of this craft, of this trade, and also the power this craft has. Thank you.
Grazie a Julie.
Thank you, Julie Claustre, for this interesting presentation dealing profoundly with trades, crafts and trades in Paris, but also, and in parallel, details about the sources which came to general conclusions about trades and crafts, about the spaces of trades as well, and about professional groups within the same crafts. So your conclusions are perfectly, part of our conference, of this year's conference, which is quite a complex topic, as we know, because we are not considering only the corporations, but also associations and different forms of solidarity. But I'm going to leave the floor to Matthew Davies from the University of London, Civic, Government and Corporations, Regulating the Trades of Late Medieval London.
And I thank the organisers of the study week for accepting my proposal and all the participants here today. So in the paper, I want to explore the relationship between civic government and the craft guilds in late medieval. The oversight of the trades between about 1300 and 1500. And the main proposition here is that London's guilds occupied an intermediate position as semi-public regulators, exercising authority that was real and consequential, but also delegated, supervised, and ultimately constrained by the city government, and above all by the highest chamber of municipal government, made up of the mayor and aldermen of London. London's guilds are generally very well documented from the 14th century onwards, especially the so-called Greater Guilds, which we heard from this morning with Patrick, a group which from the 16th century was known as the Great 12. Whilst we have many individual studies of guilds as organisations and of their members, we have fewer comparative studies of regulation, and despite regulation being precisely the area where, as I'll show, guilds intersected most directly with civic government. Much of the historiography therefore underplays the extent of these interactions, and this is magnified by a focus on the greater trades in much of the writing. So this paper hopes to reposition London's guilds within urban governments rather than alongside it, if you like, and hopefully contribute to an understanding of the political economy of the city in this period. So, some questions. There are four broad questions I want to ask here. First, how were craft guilds positioned within London's system of urban governance? How did civic authorities and guilds interact in the regulation of trades? Did civic oversight vary between sectors and types of trades? And finally, how did the balance between guild self-regulation and civic control change over time? And what factors determine these trends? For example, organisational trajectories, demographic crises, and developments in urban government and politics. So there are different ways we can answer these questions, but today I want to focus on three key areas where civic and corporate authority most clearly interacted in medieval London. First of all, the approval of craft officials. An essential requirement of the city government was that craft officials were able to act on its behalf, especially in controlling access to citizenship as well as to markets and labour. Second, there's the approval of craft ordinances, and these are simultaneously normative, practical, as well as symbolic manifestations of authority and regulation. And finally, a bit about the practice of enforcement, where those arrangements were tested and where we can see how the relationships between guilds and the city worked on the ground. In other words, I want to take a fairly high-level look at the volume, nature, and chronology of interactions between the top tier of city government and the trades in a period which saw significant proliferation as well as consolidation in organisational structures, the guilds. So the main source I'll be drawing on is the city letter books, so called because each was assigned a letter, in this case G. They contain detailed records of the proceedings of the highest chamber, the Court of Aldermen, presided over by the mayor, and these survive in an unbroken series from 1275 onwards. And they're important because they record routine interactions between city and craft governance over 2 centuries and show that craft regulation was far from being an internal corporate matter, but was a dimension of civic government itself, which has perhaps been understated in the historiography to date. Before turning to the approval of officials and wardens, it's important to situate these discussions within the structure of civic power in London, especially the Court of Aldermen, the highest chamber of city government. This was geographically based, with 25 leading citizens representing the city's wards. London's mayors and aldermen, as we can see here, were dominated by what later became the Great 12 companies, and increasingly so over time. These were largely mercantile, elite trades, and their dominance framed the practice of regulation. There were some changes over time, the declining influence of the fishmongers, for example, and the rise of the tailors and haberdashers. So regulation therefore operated within a hierarchical political economy, not a neutral administrative framework, and we'll see how this played out in the guild economy. So to start with, we can look at the approvals of guild officials, masters and wardens, by the city government. Their names were formally recorded from the early 14th century, which is a requirement of the city government, which specified the important role of wardens in regulating apprenticeship and hence access to citizenship. In the later 14th century, this became highly bureaucratized. Wardens for many trades were sworn together in concentrated bursts of civic activity and recorded en masse in the letter books. We can see here an example of crafts whose wardens were sworn at particular dates in 1377 and 1378. This wasn't simply a symbolic recognition of autonomy, but a means of incorporating guild officers into the civic regulatory system in a period when London's economy was diversifying and guilds were developing rapidly within many of the recognised trades in the city. The approval of wardens did not happen every year for every craft, but nonetheless were extremely frequent events from the 1300s to the middle of the 15th century. Across the whole period, there were 675 recorded events in which craft officials from a total of 175 individual crafts were presented before the mayor and aldermen. This allows us to look at the types of crafts whose officials were approved and also at the chronology, at the maturing of a system of oversight that began in a period of very intensive governmental and economic development. The large number of 175 crafts is important. Across the period, and especially in the 14th century, many trades had wardens for a while, but did not develop further structures, and were eventually merged with other trades as part of the sort of umbrella guilds we've heard about already. So it's an index of economic activity, as well as proliferation and consolidation of structures. And the key point of this slide is to emphasise the almost complete lack of approvals for those crafts which formed London's civic elite. The mercers, the premier guild in London, appear only once, the drapers not at all. While their wardens were still expected to undertake the same functions of regulating their trades, they were hardly ever subject to civic approval, although of course recorded regularly in the guild's own records. So we can see here that only 7% of the approvals involved the greater guilds, with 93% concerning the mostly other artisan trades. So routine civic scrutiny was not directed evenly across the guild system, but was produced in relation to structures of wealth and power. If we look a bit further at the 675 approvals, we can get a sense of the city government's priorities in terms of the sectors of the economy where regulation seems to be a particular priority. We can see clearly that textiles and clothing trades, more than 30 named crafts, dominate the approvals, followed by metalworking and a long tail of specialist trades, reflecting the growing diversity of organised trades in medieval London. The wardens of the city's weavers, one of the oldest guilds, were approved on 33 occasions between 1340 and 1430, a mark of the significance of English wool and cloth manufacture in the later Middle Ages. Food and drink trades do not appear as frequently as one might expect, perhaps, given the significance of provisioning for the municipal government. Later, we will see that there was much greater interest in ordinances relating to the prices and quality of foodstuffs. Textile manufacturing trades were, of course, labour-intensive, export-oriented and politically sensitive, and these are precisely the sectors where the city was most anxious to anchor regulation securely. If we look more closely at the chronology of approvals of craft officials, a very clear pattern emerges. In the early 14th century, approvals are rare and sporadic. Many crafts were still loosely organised, and the city's interest in formally swearing wardens appears limited and reactive rather than systematic. This changes sharply from the mid-14th century onwards, especially after the Black Death. First of all, many crafts were formalising their internal governance, moving from loose groups of good men to more standardised offices of masters and wardens. The city responded by requiring these officials to be publicly sworn, explicitly embedding them within the civic regulatory framework. So we can see a consolidation in processes of guild formation. So 175 crafts becomes around 80 to 100 guilds, which continue to change in number and composition. Second, of course, this was a period of acute economic and civic disruption. Plague, labour shortages, rising mobility and pressure on wages heightened concern about standards and market order. Requiring officials to appear before the mayor and alderman was a way of reasserting civic control at moments of crisis. And the peak in the 1370s and 1380s is revealing. These decades saw political instability within London, with the roles of crafts and guilds debated. And the mass swearing of officials could be read as part of a broader attempt to stabilise the economic and social order through regulation. After the mid-15th century, the approval of wardens declines rapidly, and large-scale collective approvals completely disappear from the sources. This should not be read, I don't think, as a retreat from regulation. By this point, most crafts had stable structures and routine mechanisms for appointing offices. Civic authority did not vanish. It became less visible because it had been effectively internalised. So to summarise this section, the approval of officials functioned as a form of delegated civic authority, recognising and benefiting from the rapid development of craft structures. Oversight was uneven, focusing on non-elite trades, and especially on the large and vital textile sector. An intensive 14th century scrutiny coincided with the political and economic crises, as well as the proliferation of guild structures. And then this sharp decline later on reflects mature and largely consolidated corporate structures and increased civic trust in internal appointments. If we now turn to the approval of ordinances and statutes by the city government, we've almost 200 instances of crafts guilds presenting their ordinances for approval, something which in theory is mandated by the city government. Many crafts presented their ordinances on multiple occasions. The coopers provide a useful example here. Across the 15th century, the coopers returned repeatedly to the mayor or alderman, sometimes with comprehensive regulatory frameworks, sometimes with specific corrective petitions. The trademarks I showed on the very first slide were written into the letterbooks in 1420 at the request of the coopers. And the petition in 1428 reflects something that came up earlier about people in other guilds who were regulated by the guild of the trade that they represented. And this of course reflects the fact that, as we all know, ordinances were living instruments revised in response to changing conditions and always subject to civic authorisation. But the Coopers are just one example. We have many examples like this of repeated enrolment and revision of ordinances, reflecting these shifts towards a more settled regulatory system. As with the officials, we can analyse data to look at the patterns of the crafts which came forward with their ordinances. So we have 170 approval events, if you like, involving 85 guilds. This is perhaps a more realistic number in terms of the number of guilds in London in this period, and they're perhaps a better index of guild structures than the numbers of wardens. But again, 95% were from the lesser so-called trades. Only 5 of the greater guilds ever presented their ordinances over the entire period I've been looking at. So again, we can see guilds such as the mercers and drapers being effectively exempted from the normal requirement to routinely present their ordinances to the mayor and alderman. Their political dominance and their representation on the Court of Aldermen insulated them from this aspect of regulation. By contrast, many smaller trades, often with less political leverage and closer ties to labour market and consumer protection, were expected to formalise their rules under civic supervision. So turning to occupational structures once again, unsurprisingly, textiles and clothing again form the largest category of ordinance approvals. And this sector combines several features that attracted sustained civic attention: labour-intensive, economically significant, tied to export markets, and particularly sensitive to post-plague disruption. But also notable here is the relative prominence, compared with previously, of food and drink trades. They are much more visible and reflects the city's enduring concern with provisioning, prices, fraud and public order. These ordinances were often corrective in nature, responding to recurrent anxieties in London as in other cities about scarcity, adulteration and disorder. Metalworking and leather trades were a second tier of regulated activity. These were technically complex crafts where defective workmanship obviously had economic and reputational consequences. And again, civic approval served to anchor specialist craft rules within a broader framework of urban activity. So taken together, this underlines that ordinance approval was not simply about standard setting across the economy. It was a targeted and differentiated strategy shaped by civic priorities, perceptions of risk, and the relative political leverage of different sectors. And again, if we can view this chronologically, we can see that ordinance approvals peaked decisively in the later 14th century, especially in the 1360s and 1370s. And again, they coincide with proliferation and recognition of guilds by both the city and also by the Crown, the impacts of plague and population loss, labour scarcity and wage pressure, and an intensified political contestation in the city centring on participation and the roles of the crafts. So this is a period of regulatory construction when civic government actively shaped craft governance. In the 15th century, ordinance approval does not disappear, but its character changes. It becomes more dispersed and in many cases more corrective. Instead of authorising wholesale regulatory frameworks, the city increasingly dealt with specific clauses, reaffirmations or targeted interventions, which suggests that the basic architecture of regulation had already been established. The burst of ordinance approvals in the 1480s was really exceptional, a response from more than 20 guilds to a specific edict from the mayor and aldermen reminding them of the need to enrol their statutes. So the chronology shows a shift from regulatory construction in the 14th century to one of regulatory maintenance and adjustment in the 15th, as we can see with the Coopers and other trades like them. Ordinance approval became less frequent because regulation had become more stable, more internalised and more routine. So to sum up this second section, the requirement for civic approval, of course, is central. It confirms that ordinances were never purely internal documents for most of the trades. However specialist or corporately grounded, ordinances only acquired authority when recognised by the city. So regulation operated within a single civic framework, not parallel or autonomous jurisdictions. Ordinance approval was selective and hierarchical. As with approval officials, the greater guilds largely avoided routine scrutiny, whilst many other trades, especially artisan and service occupations, were required to submit their ordinances repeatedly. This reflects power relations as much as regulatory need. Then chronology sharpens the picture further. The peaks in the late 14th century reflect a moment when two things coincided. Crafts were formalising their internal rules, and the city was actively pulling those rules into civic oversight in response to crisis, plague, labour shortage, wage pressure, and political instability. The 15th century looks quieter, not because regulation weakened, but because it changed in character. Ordinance approval became more episodic and corrective, focused on clauses or reaffirmations of authority. This points perhaps to a more mature system in which the basic architecture of regulation was already in place and civic authority was being maintained rather than constructed. And finally, I want to look briefly at some qualitative examples from the City of London letterbooks, which reveal how this system functioned in practice. Again, some of the changes over time are important here as well. Guilds detected offences and seized defective goods, but in many cases judgment and punishment were often civic as well as delegated events. So when the Skinners confiscated false furs in 1384, or the cappers identified defective caps in 1311, it was the mayor and aldermen who condemned the goods and ordered penalties, often publicly. Enforcement powers were therefore delegated but conditional. Civic courts also controlled inter-guild boundaries, overriding charters where necessary, as in the case of the Weavers and the Burlars dispute of 1335. And after the Black Death, guild inspections were tightly linked to civic sanctions in many guild ordinances, such as those of the farriers and the founders. By the 15th century, there were many fewer such interventions made by the city government. Not because their authority had weakened, but because earlier settlements had stabilised practice and drawn boundaries, and because, in particular, many of the guilds had developed more robust internal systems to deal with breaches of statutes. Enforcement was much less of a public performance of civic authority than it had been before. So, some conclusions. London's guilds were neither autonomous nor subordinate, but semi-public regulators. Regulation was uneven, and it was economically and politically structured, with artisan and textiles trades most closely scrutinised. The 14th century was the formative regulatory moment, shaped by crisis and contestation, as well as organisational development. Civic authority remained ultimately decisive in judgment and enforcement. And then 15th century changes reflect the consolidation, not decline, and a different balance between the roles of city and guild authorities. And each trade and each guild had its own trajectory within this common framework and chronology. So I think in these ways, London aligns closely with broader European patterns of negotiated urban governments, while retaining distinctive institutional features that reflect the trajectory of guild formation in the city. Thank you for listening.
Grazie, Mattia Davies, per questa.
Thank you, Matthew Davies, for your presentation. So you're presenting here a fundamentally critical topic for our week, which is the relationship between corporations or cooperative organizations and public powers. And so as we have seen from your analysis, well, the landscape, the context is never easy, and there is never the possibility of have too rigid, too neat, picture of the situation. So you have, of course, depicted, the power, the application of public power, which has different, which is multifaceted. So this depicts a more complex, world or European landscape. Now we have Mattia Fochesato from the Università Bocconi in Milan, the guilds and the Republic, labor regulation, and the centralization of the political economy in Florence during the 15th century.
I work in English, so even if I grew up in Prato, actually, I would speak in English. And so my work is starts as a much broader project that I have on a topic that is not strictly related with the problem of the Guild and the Republic, but then examining this problem, which I will explain to you in a second, then I went into this debate more properly and actually linking this issue to the thing that I want to study. So the point of departure for my work was this sort of puzzle that exists in understanding the condition of urban workers in Florence during the 14th and 15th century. And this is to some extent well-known evidence or well-known established fact, the fact that there is a continuous demographic shock that starts with the Black Death in 3048 and then it continues throughout the 15th centuries. But at the same time we see, while as expected, an increase in the economic conditions, namely captured here by work compensation of urban workers throughout the second half of the 14th century. During the 15th century, these wages tend to decline. And so my research question more generally are, why did the labor's economic and working conditions deteriorate, even in a condition of labor scarcity, which persisted throughout the 15th century? And whether the reason of this increase and persistence might be found in a different capacity or ability of the guilds to, let's say, counteract the workers' increasing bargaining power. So, more broadly, my question is the condition, under which conditions labor scarcity in the past fostered or not improvement of workers' economic conditions. This is part of a more general project that I have, which I'm writing and since too long time now, which is this book draft that I have on Florence. I will show you in my presentation here some reappraisal of the work that I've done on the sources to try to understand the impact of these demographic shocks to establish properly this dimension of labor scarcity. I will show you evidence on the changing of the prosperity of the Florentine workers, and then I will also show you some preliminary analysis on what I consider to be the institutional change. So, just to spoiler the conclusion, my idea, my conjecture is that there is a change in the attitude of the government towards the enforcement of controversies between the guilds and the laborers, more generally, and there is a sort of like learning process through which the government provides progressively, by the beginning of the 15th century, stably, a mechanism of enforcement that gives to the guilds more power in these controversies. So, in terms of demographic shocks and population change, I can go very quickly through this part, but I just put some ideas here. The growth of Florence is going back to some concepts that Patrick mentioned this morning, is a sort of like Smithian growth, so is a growth of an urban economy that is supported by population increase, both of natural increase of population in the city, but also migration from the rural areas. That happens up to the mid of the 14th century. And these also facilitated labor division, economic expansion, but however, as all the Smithian growth processes, it's very vulnerable to demographic shocks, right? So during the 14th century, starting with the Black Death, we have this very dramatic shock. The point of what I'm trying to recollect in one chapter of the book is that the recurrent epidemics that are happening both in the second half of the 14th century and throughout the 15th century are less intense, of course, if compared to the Black Death, but they're not less dramatic. So they continuously hit this population, they continuously hit the labor force. There is a problem in recovering of population. So I put together all numbers that I could find as most critically as possible, recollected here. And here you have, for the period that goes up to the 3085, population are those dots with the confidence interval depending on different sources. The dashed lines are the shocks, the main shocks reported in the chronicles. So of course you have the Black Death, and then you have at least other three big plagues. And as you can see, the population collapse, and then it remains quite low. There is a sort of like recovery before the 3083, but then there is another shock. Then I exploited also the information from the books of the dead. They have some problems, of course, so there is an internal problem of reporting, etc. But I tried to measure sort of like intensity of plagues by measuring the deviation in reported death in the books of the dead from the normal number of deaths, the average number of deaths per year. And as you can see, the urban population are the black dot again. These are taken from the catastrophe and tax records. The dashed lines is this percentage discrepancy in recorded deaths from the average number of deaths reported in the books. So what I'm assuming here is constant bias, for instance, so that the documentation is internally consistent, which is already got great leap of faith. But as you can see, the subsequent shocks are very dramatic. So it's 8 times more deaths recorded in 1400 than in the average number throughout the whole period. And also, for example, the 4068 is 5 times higher. So all of this to say the demographic shocks were very high, dramatic, and recurrent. There is a change also in the distribution of the occupation. Here I want to cite myself and what I presented 2 years ago here at the Datini. It's a work that I've done and presented here. It's in the proceedings of the 2 years ago Atti. And the impact of the plagues is also compositional on labor. So we exploited numbers from tax records, implemented and increased by analyzing records of those who were not reporting their occupation and exploiting further information, me and Francesco Bettarini, and we found out that there is a decrease throughout the period of the wool workers and an increase in the other textiles, which also mirrors a change in the productive structure of Florence. In terms of worker compensation, here I analyze all the possible sources and numbers provided for mostly the building sector, but also from the wool sector that Franco has studied, and measured the real wages through measures that is called the welfare ratio, sort of evaluation of the earnings of individuals with respect to the subsistency. Here, the basic interpretation here is that if the number is above 1, it means that workers are above subsistence. If the number is below 1, the workers is starving, and the family is starving as well. So as you can see, these are more unskilled workers, generally defined as workers who don't have a qualification in the building sector and in the wool sector. And I put them together, you see that there is an increase of workers' compensation that goes up to the first quarter of the 15th century. And then there is a decline in this workers' compensation, marking the end of the so-called golden age of laborers. And so the question my questions enters exactly at this point. Right? So the demographic shocks and the demographic stagnation continues up to the end of the 15th century, but the workers' compensation do not persist at high level. So they decline. So what is changing? And that goes back to the question that I asked before, under which condition the labor scarcity foster or not the improvement of workers' economic condition. And the focus that I'm giving here, where I am directing my research, is on the institutional conditions that were determining whether the workers' bargaining power translated into an effective improved economic condition, or was it limited by employer and possibly the government intervention. And at the moment, what I've done is just an analysis of the workers' intervention on the subject, combined with some guilds' intervention. And what I found out, I will show you in a second, is 2 phases in the Florentine history after the Black Death. There is a first phase of decentralized response in the decades following the Black Death. And then there is a phase of centralization of institutional action that starts with the statuti of the people and communities of Florence in 1415. And my argument will be, possibly in the future, that this is providing a decisive marking change in the capability of guilds to coordinate. So in terms of the decentralized response, so after the Black Death, labor regulation in Florence was very decentralized, scarce at the government intervention. So there are norms that are issued mainly focusing on rural work. These are the laws contra laboratores, 3060, analyzed by Sam Cohn. And they're aiming to limit mobility, wage demands, while they remain very cautious related with urban labor markets. There are interventions in the urban labor markets, but they look very weak, temporary, and weakly enforced. Guilds, in turns, they try to regulate their own market. So, for example, the Wool Guild issued multiple norms to try to cap wages, but as I've shown you, possibly they were not able to do so. I mean, I can even show you, not today, but the nominal wages remain quite high, so before deflating them. So these are some interventions, but then at the level of the government, in 3055, the recollection of norms of the city that goes under the Statuti del Capitano, the captain of the people, and the Statuti del Podestà, they confirm, in my opinion, so in my reading, the lack of initiative by the government to intervene in labor regulation. So for instance, and precisely, in the Statuti of the Captain of the People, there are more than 400 rubriche, articles, in all the 4 books, and I found reference only to 11 articles to salaries, and only one of them is about manufacturing workers and bakers, which is very sensitive activity. There is no other norm related with labor or guild government relationship. In the Statuti of the Podestà, I think there is a similar trend of not regulating labor. So there are more than 500 articles, and only 6 concern salaries. And these are most official salaries. There's only one norms regulating wool. But in the second book, in the Rubrica 85, I found very interesting that the government is issuing a norm in which it affirms that the sentences and the decisions issued by the Guild's Council cannot be appealed in other tribunal in the city, nor in the mercancy or the Podestà. So this is, in my interpretation, affirming an independence of the Guild's decisions from any other institutional powers. So what happens later? In the 1415, in the Statuti Populi e Communis Florentiae, I claim that there is a pivotal change in the reorganization of the Florentine legislative system, which also marks a clear change in the institutional intervention in labor regulation. So there's a strong intervention in many aspects of the political economy of the city, which Franco has studied in at least 2 articles, 1993 and 1994, related with fiscal issues, related with the provision of food or trade, etc. But there are also various norms that regulate norms and compensation. They regard officials, but also members of the administrative apparatus, workers in the manufacturing sectors. But there are 2 norms, or 2 sets of norms, that I think are more interesting to what I'm interested in. So in the Liber Quartus, de Laboratorum Tractatum et Materia, namely this is a set of norms regulating labor in the countryside, these norms set limits on compensation of rural laborers, specifying both in case they're working on peacetime or piece rate or time rate, but they're also explicitly extending the validity to any other manual worker who is providing their job on a daily basis, possibly opening for implementing those norms also for those who are contributing to non-agricultural activity. They also request the local community to list such workers, so we have to know who they are, and they're setting the central Florentine justice administration as the enforcers of sanctions of the category. Okay, that's about rural laborers and possibly those who are moving between the sectors. The other set of norms in the Liber Quartus, Tractatus et Materia Consulum Artium et Mercatorum, include institutional attempts at coordinating and centralizing the enforcement of sanctions against urban workers. So in Rubrica 6, the central Florentine judicial administration is said to have the power to take final decisions on disputes among guilds. Plus, in the 7th article, the same set of institution can be appealed by guilds council for the enforcement of sanctions against workers. So if the workers is going against the decision of the guild councils can resort to the enforcement by the judiciary power and have their sanctions implemented. In the 34, if a guild member sues another person in public court outside the guild cannot punish or retaliate against him. So again, affirming that the public courts is superior with respect to the guilds. And in 35, which is similar to what Matthew was showing before, guilds cannot use statutes that are not be approved by the officials of the commune. So if you compare these with the 3055, you see that there is a difference. So in 3055, guilds were autonomous in the implementation, and they had superior power within their realm, I would say. In the 1415, it is said that the government provides an enforcement tool to guilds, but at the same time, the central judiciary power it has a superior position with respect to the guild's position. So this is enough for what I'm presenting. I don't know how much time do I have. There are I'm collecting more and more norms that are also issued by the guilds during the 15th century. But what I'm claiming is not that they're issuing more norms or less norms than before. What I'm claiming is that in the aspect of the enforcement, the guilds now have a tool that they did not have before. Plus, the government itself has a power to address public political economy, also in the aspect of labor, that the government did not undertake before. And guilds also are, interestingly now, regulating a lot about labor mobility, which is something that they were not doing before. And labor mobility matters in terms of when labor is scarce. So, just to conclude, I told you it was very preliminary. Labor scarcity, which persisted for 150 years, but not improved economic conditions for the same periods of time. At the same time, I think I documented a little bit a change in the institutional approach. So there is a period of lack of coordination that lasts until the 1410s, and in which the government does not take initiative. Actually, it leaves to the guilds supreme power in their own sectors, while from the 1415 the government takes the control of the enforcement, and also these might have worked as a sort of tool of coordination. So overall, trying to respond to my initial question, so what did foster economic conditions in period of labor scarcity, is the institutional response and centralized means for enforcement that are shaping the way in which demographic shocks impacted workers' well-being. And thank you.
Grazie Mattia.
Thank you, Mattia. You brought us in a quite different dimension. I mean, you also looked at the labor, labor force, putting in relationship the changes which took place over a century, essentially over a century, and a series of demographic shocks. So, of course, the case of Florence, the Florentine case, is maybe also a particular one, at least in Italy, because if we open up our view from this sector, so from the intervention of public power in economic life, so in relationship with guilds, so if we open up our view of what, in general, is the economic policy of Florentine government in this period, under the domination of the Albizzi family, we see that there's a strong planning in reshaping political, economical, and administrative structures. And this is a very peculiar situation we do not find in other cities and in other territories. And this is a particular stage of this process, a particular step of this process, which will then interrupt itself, which will be interrupted and which will change with the Medici family. But I will not continue on this. I will, on the contrary, leave the floor to our last speaker of this day, Mario Grassi from the University of Padova, Power Relations and Material Culture, Reconstructing the Role of Professional Associations in the silk industry within the economic structure of Savoyard Piedmont, 17th to 18th centuries. Thank you. Well, historiography, can you hear me? Yes, it works. Thank you. So historiography has often grouped the professional institutions of the Ancien Regime under the single category of guild. Whilst this definition has facilitated comparisons between different realities across time and space, it also has tended to oversimplify a complex landscape. Professional associations, in fact, took different shapes and forms depending on local social, economic, and political context, positioning themselves in different ways in relation to the market and local public regulation. Building on these considerations, I propose to examine these institutions from a different viewpoint, not merely as formally recognized, acknowledged structures, but as concrete realities rooted in the material dimension of daily life. This aspect has long remained on the margins of scholarship, despite the fact that object techniques and practices played a decisive role in defining their functioning and in shaping their collective identity. So this perspective is applied here to the silk sector of Savoyard Piedmont, and in particular to Turin between the late 17th and 18th centuries. It was a context of great significance in international economic history, since it was precisely during these years that silk yarn reached the highest standards of quality, thanks to the production of the so-called organza of Piedmont, a technique that attracted the interest of European powers right up to the 19th century. So in Turin, silk production did not give rise to a unified associative system, but rather to a plurality of trade guilds linked to the various stages of the supply chain, which differed in terms of legal status, capacity of self-protection, relationship with public authority, and presence within the urban space, reflecting interdependencies, but also a growing internal hierarchy within the sector. So from this perspective, materiality, comprising preserved objects and others known only through archival sources, is not merely a symbolic element, but rather an active component in the functioning of professional institutions within the broad socio-economic environment. Our first stop of this tour is the Santissima Annunziata complex, which in the 17th century established itself as one of the main religious and social hubs of a changing Turin, particularly in the Città di Po area, which was increasingly linked to the silk trade. Here, the relationship between the confraternity, the Brotherhood of Santissima Annunziata, and the University of Master Merchant Weavers and Gold, Silver, and Silk gradually became established. The two entities, initially institutionally distinct, nevertheless appear to have enjoyed a bond since the late 17th century, as demonstrated by the offerings made to the chapel that accompanied the weaver's admission to the guild. A decisive step took place in 1700 when the university purchased a sacred space within the church, designating it for patronal worship and the burial of its members. From here we see the red marble, as we heard today in the morning. So from that moment on, the Church of the Most Holy Annunciation became the group's principal center of devotion and association, a role reinforced throughout the 18th century until the indulgence granted by Clement the 13th in 1768 under the title of the Assumption. However, the complex did not serve a purely religious function. The adjoining rooms were used for the university's meeting, part of the examinations for admissions to the guild, and the storage of the guild's documents and artifacts. The Confraternity of the Holy Annunciation thus appears as a space where devotion, associative identity, and the governance of the guild were tangibly intertwined. It's no coincidence that the university archive is still preserved at the Confraternity today. Among the documents of this parish archive, an inventory from 1835 stands out by recording the objects and papers present in the university's room. It allows us to grasp the institution's long material history. Among the objects is a box containing 85 numbered balls, which still exist today, used to draw lots for the apprentices' examination papers. So it was a genuine institutional mechanism which, through the random drawing of examination papers, regulated access to the guild and established the quality standards of the trade. Viewed as a whole, the complex of Santissimo Annunziata appears as a neighborhood guild infrastructure in which worship, training, certification of skills, and management of the trade were closely integrated. The distinction between sacred and professional space was in fact very blurred. On the one hand, the altar reinforced collective identity. On the other, the university room facilitated the selection of masters and institutional continuity. In this sense, spaces and objects highlight the economic role of weavers, not merely producers, but actors capable of controlling access to skilled labor and, consequently, the very reproduction of the trade. Our second stop is the Merchants' Chapel, where the physical nature of the spaces takes on a different meaning compared to the Church of the Annunciation. Whereas the spaces served as tool for governing the guild, here they become instruments of prestige, visibility, and public recognition. The chapel of the pious congregation of bankers, merchants, and traders was situated in the heart of Baroque Turin, near Piazza Castello, in the Church of the Holy Martyrs. Founded between 1662 and 1663, the congregation was established in close association with the Turin Jesuits, who placed the merchant group within a highly prestigious religious and social framework. Initially, the members met in a hall of the Jesuit college, which soon proved inadequate for the group that had grown rapidly from 15 to over 250 members. The turning point came in 1692 during the reconstruction of the Santi Martiri complex, where the merchants contributed to the construction of the new chapel. Although they did not formally own it, they obtained its permanent and exclusive use, thereby reinforcing their distinctive character within the city community. The decoration, which had already begun during the construction work, shows that the space served not only practical purposes but also a specific need for prestige and self-representation. This aspect was complemented by a wealth of documentary material. We have treasury books, registers, inventories, and legal documents through which the group defined and managed its own organization. At the core of the identity shared by the members of the congregation lay the veneration of the three kings, attested as early as 1668 by a large painting of the Epiphany. The figure of the Magi offered the merchants a model for reinterpreting their wealth as a resource directed towards worship and faith. This identity found its fullest expression in the richly decorated chapel inaugurated in 1692. You can see it in the image of the slide, which very richly decorated, stands as a veritable hall of self-representation for the merchant class. The private nature of the space did not, however, prevent the congregation from projecting itself into public life, particularly through the Epiphany celebrations, where pageantry, music, and ceremonies transformed an internal worship service into a tool for collective visibility. In this way, wealth was translated into social recognition and moral dignity. The magnificence of the chapel should therefore not be seen as mere ornamentation, decoration, but as an investment in the production of social authority, through which the merchants converted economic capital into moral prestige and public recognition, thereby strengthening their leading position in the silk trade. Our third stage brings us to a more problematic case. The University of Silk Spinners in Turin, compared to merchants and master weavers who had recognized institutions and spaces capable of representing their identity and prestige, the presence of the Silk Spinners Professional Association remains far less visible. This was a professional category largely constructed from above and regulated by the Consulate of Commerce, which was progressively marginalized, partly due to the relocation of facilities to the countryside. Their forms of association are therefore more difficult to reconstruct and emerge mainly through indirect evidence. From consulate sources, we know that as early as 1676, spinners met to elect mayors and councillors, but with a limited scope of action, linked above all to the assessment of aspiring masters and the quality of products. Moreover, from the end of the 17th century, traces of these administrative activities became increasingly rare. A significant and entirely unexpected clue to further our understanding of this professional association comes from an insurance inventory from 1763, drawn up during a legal dispute between the firm Millo and Company and the spinner Giuseppe Monetti, in whose house objects belonging to the Spinners Guild, placed under the protection of St. Job, were found. The fact that these items were kept in the treasurer's home reveals a different materiality compared to previous cases, not a permanent space, but a collection of movable objects, linked above all to the devotional and ceremonial dimension. The devotional paintings, fabric banners, torches, and liturgical objects not only bore initials and dates, the earliest dating back to 1720, but were also marked with a coat of arms depicting a reclining naked man and 3 men standing with crowns. This coat of arms most likely corresponded to that recorded in a devotional leaflet from 1788, which you can see on the left in the slide, which was depicting Job and his friends, a sign of a certain symbolic continuity. A comparison of these sources also reveals the association's urban mobility. In the 1660s, the regalia was transported from the treasurer's house to the Church of the Holy Trinity in the town center, whilst in 1788 the celebrations appear to have been moved to the new Church of St. Michael, suggesting a redefinition of the urban spaces used by the professional association. Within this framework, the figure of St. Job emerges with greater clarity, offering a glimpse into the devotional dimension of the Spinners Guild. Domestic paintings and references to the Book of St. Job attest to widespread associative and religious practices. Overall, the associative life of the spinners emerges through a fragile, scattered materiality lacking firm urban roots. Unlike merchants and weavers, they did not have spaces capable of translating their presence into a lasting power to regulate the trade, resulting in a weaker institutional form of association, yet one still capable of offering cohesion, mutual recognition, and self-representation to a group essential to the silk industry. That's the final stage of our journey. It brings us to the case of the silk stocking journeyman. After weavers, merchants, and spinners, here material culture points to a different sphere, that of the struggle for professional acknowledgement and protection. Here, too, material evidence is limited, but the workers' subordinate position emerges clearly. Their story must be understood in the context of the founding in 1734 of the University of Master Silk Stocking Makers, established to defend the role of the masters as producers and sellers, but which ultimately exacerbated internal inequalities. The workers, though essential, remained without real economic protection, penalized by the preference granted to apprentices and by rules that favored the hereditary transmission of the craft. It was against this backdrop that they took a collective stand. In 1737, they appealed to the king via the consulate, asking to be established as a separate body. The request aimed to sustain a large community, some 200 workers, exposed to destitution in the event of illness or unemployment. Once a petition was granted, the University of Silk Stocking Journeyman was established, based on weekly contributions and a common fund as a minimal form of social protection. As early as the following year, however, the charitable aspect became intertwined with the demand for professional rights, leading to an inquiry into the distribution of work. The distinctive nature of this guild is revealed in an inventory dating from 1750, linked to the flight of the treasurer Antonio Gallinati. And items belonging to the Guild of Stocking Makers were in fact found in his home, namely an empty collection box, and what might be described as a veritable library archive of the association. The insurance inventory lists petitions, licenses, ordinances, collection registers, list of members, and legal documents, making the collection of papers the primary means through which the worker's identity was expressed. These documents, in fact, made the very existence of the association possible, preserving its memory, managing its resources, and providing the necessary tools of legitimization to appeal to the authorities. In short, whilst the materiality of the documents reflected a subordinate condition, it also responded to a precise strategy of action. Unable to control the trade at the level of production, the workers constructed, through writing, a space of protection and legitimacy. The sources thus reveal a group capable of organizing itself and taking action, whose weakness lay not only in their dependence on wages, but also in the need to entrust their own continuity to documents. A fragile materiality, yet one that guaranteed their legal survival and the possibility of intervening in the governance of trade. So an analysis of the professional guilds in the Piedmontese silk industry between the 17th and 18th century shows that there was no single unified entity, but rather a constellation of distinct bodies. Their position within the supply chain depended not only on legal recognition, but also on the forms of materiality that each group was able to construct and mobilize. Spaces, documents, objects, and devotional apparatus, in fact, contributed to the functioning of the guilds, their visibility, and their capacity for action. From this perspective, very different regimes of materiality emerge. At the Santissimo Annunziata, it served an infrastructural function linked to the governance of the trade, the selection of masters, and the continuity of skills. In the Merchants' Chapel, by contrast, it took on a representative function aimed at making the group's prestige visible. And in the case of the spinners, the lack of institutional recognition resulted in a dispersed and intermittent materiality linked above all to ritual. Finally, among the stocking makers, materiality was exclusively documentary, serving as the minimum condition for legal existence and collective action. So, in conclusion, through this case study, we have observed that material culture not only makes different identities visible, but also different ways of participating in the economic structure of the silk sector, helping to produce and stabilize inequalities through spaces, objects, and documents. From this perspective, even the possibility of leaving material traces appears as a resource distributed unequally, capable of defining both the identity of groups and their position within the economic and political hierarchy of the supply chain. Thank you for your attention.
Grazie a Mario che ci ha indicato una pista di ricerca che sembra molto interessante, originale che mette insieme anche dei filoni storiografici diversi, appunto uno studio diciamo con strumenti più tradizionali delle associazioni di mestiere e che invece si incrocia con quello che è il filone anche di studi sulla cultura materiale, sugli oggetti, appunto spazi, oggetti, documenti, queste tracce che ci dicono molto sulla posizione delle diverse, in questo caso delle diverse associazioni, dei diversi gruppi di mestiere della filiera serica. Abbiamo bisogno di più tesorieri che scappano con la cassa, perché così poi magari e con gli oggetti che si portano dietro, perché questo insomma ci dà la possibilità di fare le nostre considerazioni. Bene, allora direi che possiamo fermarci come al solito per una pausa e chi è interessato a formulare delle domande può riempire gli appositi moduli. Grazie, sono diciamo 4:45, insomma tendenziale. Le domande.
So let's start with the questions for Julie. Thomas Herz.
It was a great paper. Thanks. I've been studying the Vienna property market for some time now, and I'm a great admirer of the work Paris, de Parcelles en Pixels, or something like that. It was the title of this book about the Paris property market and the attempt to reconstruct social topography of late medieval Paris. So my question is the property market anything you could use to distinguish between the location of the métiers and the differentiation between royal métiers and artisans which are not linked to the king?
Allora, Nicoletta Rolla.
Molte grazie per questa
Thank you. This session, the speeches of this session are really interesting.
territoriale à l'étude des
So concerning the territorial approach, concerning this study, well, this approach through the juridical, the legal plurality, we have this expression of local jurisdiction on territory. Well, my question is actually an insight or a curiosity, let's say. I would like to say, starting from the perspective of who starts the process in the court, at court, in which way do the actors play in the different jurisdictions? How do they move among the different jurisdictions? Do they have a strategical play in the different jurisdictions? Do you notice something like that? And do you notice differences among the different territories? Are there different characteristics in, boundary regions? Mathieu? Grazie, Julie. Well, my question is between space of workspace and selling space. How are these spaces differentiated? How do they overlap? In the extent in which we talk about spatial segmentation. So are these spacing overlapping in the period you have focused on, and in which way taxation and fiscal aspect and fiscality is distinguished in the different spaces, so in the workspaces and selling spaces? Professor Sabatini. So but before posing my question, I would like to thank the two speakers who talked about the Florence and the silk production in Piedmont. I learned a lot from your presentation. I found them really very, very interesting. To Julie, I would like to pose the following question. Well, the aspect you talked about is extremely marginal. At a certain point, you showed a kind of paper roll in your presentation. Well, I guess I guess it was like a roll of papers put together, maybe glued together to give it a form of a roll. What I would like to understand, if you know it, when was it produced, this paper roll? When and how? At which moment in time? Which kind of paper was it? Well, maybe this is a bit too detailed question, but yes, I'm very curious about it. Also about the type of paper. This just to show that I deal not only with paper. Another question for Julie as well. Also a bit weird, this one as well. You know, you have pottery makers. This means you have kilns. Are they terracotta kiln? Oh, the pottery are of terracotta. So, do you also, was there also the production of bricks? Which is the main production about? So what is mainly cooked in these kilns? Thank you. Arnaldo.
Oui, merci. J'aimais beaucoup les quatre présentations, mais j'ai des questions dans ce moment pour Julie.
I have questions to Julie. I really appreciated your presentation, Julie. Two questions now. That's a question of jurisdiction, of course, goes without saying. We have three lords, three different jurisdictions, three different jurisdictional spaces in Paris, if I got you right. Three, so this is also in relation to the point, this point. Are they included in other more extended litigation as to the jurisdictional aspect between these two lords in Paris, or is it specific for crafts in a wider context? And the second question, did you also find in the same craft, to repeat, for some points, is one craft is more related to one lordship and another craft is more related to another seigneury or lordship? In Portugal, butchers in some towns are under the control of the lordship, but the chapter adjusts the possibility of using butcheries according to this authorization. So butcher shops under jurisdiction of the commune, before the authorization of butcher shops, they're just under authority of the chapter, to which taxes must be paid. Is there also this difference in Paris for crafts?
Une dernière. Pour Paris, on pense toujours au livre des métiers, évidemment, que vous avez pas.
So, you have spoken also the relationship with the royal power. It's very interesting to know under which jurisdiction the use of the butchery was, and the butcher shop was as well. There were also the presidents of the lordships, maybe.
Pour Julie,
For Julie, I would like to congratulate you for this very interesting idea of the economic spaces and jurisdictional spaces heterogeneous. So we also debated about the possible applications for Portugal, and in Oporto we have another problem. Real Douro in Paris, we have two different rivers, like you have the Seine in Paris. We have some jurisdictional management problems between the right and the left bank of the river. Also, in the right part, we have the deepest part of the river, and on the other bank instead is under the jurisdiction of the king and the jurisdiction of the bishop. So there's a sort of conflict as to the management of the two banks of the river. Matthew in English now. Can you speak English?
Prego. Jolie, rispondi subito, sì.
Alors, je vais...
So I would like to answer the questions in order being asked. Maybe I would like to start with the historiographic traditions. As I said, as a matter of fact, we have some. Of course, as already said, we have some connection between the seigneurial crafts. Gustave Agnès have already found some elements on Saint-Geneviève. We are at the end of the 19th century. And also, there's been just l'école des Chartes thesis in the 50s. This is written down in my paper. Françoise Lou, on Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Bourse, in a general way, that already found some elements on the graphs. But these École des Chartes is a very difficult test to find out, not very well known, neither in France. And despite these discoveries of Françoise, no one has talk of this. In 29, on his thesis on butcher shops, the meat market in Paris has shown against the existence of many butcher shops, and also to consider other activities, but meat. That's for the historiographic question raised. So the disputes between several jurisdictions are not just about crafts. I've been talking of craft corporations, which is not relatively known. The conflicts of jurisdiction between the seniority and the government are many. You can find these conflicts in the same books, on the same archives. There's lots of disputes between the lordship and the commune, who is going to judge the homicide or other things. In Sainte-Geneviève, we have some chapters that speak of professional issues in this book on justice of Saint-Julien. Saint-Geneviève, as like Saint-Germain-des-Prés, are just connected with this dimension. I mean, does big power on the craft. They can control the activities and part of the economic activities of these crafts, just to work also with the representatives as well of these crafts. Well, so what else? I go back to the other questions raised for the space connotation in Paris. We're being helped by the Alpage project. So the existence of some geographical information system, which has given some idea on the task data. We can try to find some, connections between the type of documents I have and the task data collected, gathered so far. I didn't get any time to do so, to do in this systematic way, but it goes with some saying we should do this in a systematic way. I've been showing so far the only craft I've been tested for which I got the feeling we have some space connotation very interesting in my view, where we have to do things in a very systematic way, taking a systematic approach according to several cases. But still, with some crafts, we do not find in the task resources. We don't have taxpayers, or we don't have enough taxpayers to make these comparisons. We have big difficulties. I don't know if I properly answer your question, because I got a problem to following with the translation. So coming back to the issue of the jurisdictional pluralism, That's something I want to understand. This political and legal pluralism is going to last some centuries. That's even the case in the 17th century. We see traces also of another period as well. So the question how the stakeholders work in this juridical pluralism is difficult to follow. Who is taking this initiative of these processes? Well, for the documents I've been browsing for the time was given to these questions, I cannot answer. I just found this investigation, which is a sort of trial, which has been started by the king, Tournay, so, on behalf of the king himself. But to speak plain, I cannot go any farther than this, as far as my memory serves me well now. For the play or the action of the stakeholders on several jurisdiction, I didn't find any report. We have to go further beyond, and we have a lot of work to do still. We have plenty of things to do in order to get straight to a very important answer given to this question raised. We have to make the point of the situation, the state of the art. But if we look at other litigation, professional litigations, we can find those things have been mentioned so far in your remarks. Well, so what? The very difficult question, one left. So when answering, I'm showing that I'm a bit ignorant as to the overlaps, residence, work, and sale. So these overlapping. So I think this is in connection with another question raised. So, well, here we go. So legal, judicial pluralism is more than these. The Parisian lords exert rights on the houses, on the lots of land. We have just a lord being just the owner of a palace of a street, and another building on the same street. It's very complex from the jurisdictional viewpoint, and as the workshops are just on the street, on the road, many things occur in the street space when just entering the workshops. For the time being, I trouble to think that the power of being on the street is the one being just object to many disputes and litigations. So the power of standing on the street, and we have a long standing and lasting investigation, overlay, place of residence, place of work, and place of sale, this overlapping. And I'm very ignorant, totally ignorant. I don't know. That's something which is going to complicate my lifetime. And thank you very much for this suggestion, but I don't know. I can't give you an answer time because I don't know anything about this. I will try to be more focused on these issues as well, as I will be doing well. And I don't know anything of these material of the role, so I like it. But the material of the role, I don't know. So the paper was quite widely used in Paris, with some elements about the content of the material of this role, of this scroll, starting from the beginning of the 14th century, and above all, you know. So in some ecclesiastical lordships have been just pioneers in spreading the use of paper in Paris. And also for the pottery, you know, the earth pottery, so, and cooking also. So I will try to get more information about technical questions raised in the investigation. The investigative survey is just over many decades. I will try if there are some elements available. I don't get the feeling it's the case. I cannot give you any further information. I make an apology. My bad. I hope I didn't left behind any questions raised to me for time being. Thank you.
Allora, proseguiamo.
So we keep going for questions to Matthew Davies, Thomas Earth.
Thank you. I have a question. The people involved. First the English. Is there the overlap between people being in the guilds and in the government, or is there not? And if there is an overlap, which exists in many German cities, for instance, what does this mean for your perspective on the relationship between the authorities and the guilds? And secondly, the non-English. After the peasants' revolt, the Flemish were killed, the Italians' houses were looted, and the German Hanse merchants were able to hide amongst friends. At least that's what the chronicles say. So how are the non-English merchants and artisans integrated into these systems? What kind of role do they play? Thank you.
Grazie. Renzo Sabatini.
Ancora una domanda strana oggi.
Another strange question. Today is the afternoon of strange things. I've seen that in the 80s of the 15th century, we have a lot of recognitions by the civic authorities. I've seen the flow chart. So the 80s of this century are also the years of the settlement of the Tudor dynasty. So the question, is there any connections, any links with the end of some problems? You know what I mean, don't you? At the court, at the royal court. And these recognitions, can you elaborate on these recognitions period? Mathieu Merot. Thank you for these presentations. And I make an excuse, I apologize if I'm just focusing on some words about regulation by the guilds in London in medieval ages. I've just a question on the functioning of this, the functioning of crafts. So you've been working on these crafts, okay. How can they develop this functionalist vision of their role in the town? And if they do not develop the functionalist vision, what can we do as historians? So how can we judge this and also present this functionalist vision of regulation? This is the 17th and the 18th century. Patrick Wallace. Grazie.
About the implications of a guild engaging with the city, and particularly, to what extent do you think that the enforcement and the support of the city is conditional on participating, having your wardens sworn in, having your ordinances approved? And is there any sense that being willing to engage with the city gives you the power that you as a guild in that lesser level of organisations might need? Thank you.
Grazie. Prego.
Thank you for those questions. So the first question was about people. Looking at the membership of the government, and in London there were two chambers. One was the Court of Aldermen, which I was talking about primarily, which is where all of the ordinances and wardens are approved. There's also the Common Council, which is the second chamber, which was also drawn from the city's wards, geographical wards, apart from some experiments when they were drawn from the crafts. Those experiments were short-lived and they ended. The representation of the Court of Common Council, the second chamber, is much broader, but not very deep into the artisan crafts. It has some artisan crafts, but not very many. But the Court of Aldermen, as I showed, is dominated by the merchants from, in this period, about 7 or 8 guilds. And they are all guild members. So the Court of Aldermen isn't a merchant guild by another name, effectively. It's not that. It's, these all come from guilds. But they've sort of, it's as if they've agreed between each other not to approve each other's ordinances. So there's a kind of compact existing between these greater guilds and their members who become aldermen and mayors in this period, so which I think is interesting, I think. Where it does get interesting, even more interesting, is when there are controversies between those greater guilds, whether it's to do with how they should deal with aliens, and I'll come to those in a minute, or whether it's to do with important decisions about trade. For example, there's a big dispute in the 1470s about whether London merchants should be allowed to go to fairs and markets in the countryside. And half of the senior guilds say no, half of the senior guilds say yes, we should go. So they have a vote, ultimately. So they have to try and reconcile sometimes conflicting interests in the Court of Aldermen, mostly to do with overseas trade and domestic trade. When it comes to aliens, I mean, that's a topic I've written about elsewhere in the London Guilds, and there's an interesting history there, as you know, between, on the one hand, integration into the trades, where trades such as the goldsmiths trade, the tailoring industry, is very dependent on migrant labour from outside of England, and there's a substantial presence from the Low Countries in London, as Jim Bolton and other colleagues have demonstrated. So there's a dependence. At the same time, there's xenophobia. And in the late 15th century, there's a whole series of measures by the English royal government, as well as by the city government, in response to petitions from the guilds saying we want to protect the opportunities for, it's a common story in many towns and cities. So there's a sort of ambivalence, there's a contradiction, I think, between dependence on alien labour and skills and technologies, but also a feeling that the guilds need to protect the interests of their sort of domestic, their own apprentices and their opportunities. So this sort of conflicting position pertains for the whole of the 15th century and into the 16th century as well. So it's a very interesting topic, I know. So thank you. So you're talking about the question about the recognizances. I think you're talking about in the change into the Tudor government. This is a period when London throughout the 15th century keeps its options open in terms of political allegiances, and many. We have the famous Wars of the Roses, as we call them, the civil wars in England, and at all times London's looking after its own interests. So continuity, stability, those are really important factors for the merchants. They're appalled at the government policies of Henry VI, who favoured Italian merchants in particular. So they're much happier with the Yorkist government. There's less of a controversy around Henry VII, actually, when he comes to the throne. There are London merchants who were clearly in touch with that regime. But I think that there's a sense in which London looks after itself. There are London merchants who get caught up in the politics, and so they end up getting pardons, recognizances, other kinds of interactions with the royal government in that period. So I hope that sort of answers your question. The question about functions. Well, I think the guilds do develop functions, and they develop regulatory functions to a very high degree. And in a sense, those ordinances are not just sort of performative descriptions of what they do in theory. That the records we do have for the guilds show them out and about and enforcing those regulations. So what I'm not suggesting is that the city somehow takes away the powers of the guilds. I don't think it does. I think it's legitimizing and approving the ability of those guilds to do their jobs, and that they are delegates of the city government, and that's very clear from the late 13th century into the 14th century, when the bureaucracy of the City of London develops, where the roles of the crafts and the guilds are very clearly defined. It's clear that these craft organisations have significant functions. It's just that they are, they have to be approved and agreed by the city government. I think the sort of functionalist approach is important. At the same time, there are other functions that, as we all know, and again, we haven't talked a lot about, but the social, religious, charitable functions of the organisations are incredibly important at the same time. And I think in the background to this proliferation of guilds are the proliferation of functions as well. And making them attractive for people to belong to is an incredibly important part of that. I think Patrick's question is a really interesting one. So do guilds get a pat on the back from the city by engaging? I think clearly that it's in their interest to a degree. Approval of their ordinances means something to the guilds. There are many crafts which don't seem to have their ordinances approved very often, and in a way that absence is something I need to look more into. Which crafts are sort of bypassing city approval, and does that have any negative consequences for them? At the same time, what are the positive consequences? It's also, as you know, the guilds are also looking outside London for power and for privileges. The London guilds, and this is a peculiarity possibly of the English context too, many London guilds look to the royal government for powers, for royal charters, and Patrick, you showed some of the dates of those going back to the early 14th century. So there's a sense in which craft organisations were looking for legitimacy in different places, and that was important to them, both as corporate bodies, being able to do stuff, to sue each other, to hold property, that kind of thing, but also to be able to potentially get a competitive advantage over other crafts. And again, as we all know, there are significant overlaps between trades in many cities, and people do allied things, do a variety of things, so that if you're able to get your ordinances in front of the mayor and aldermen, that's an important step you can take. So you can see in some of these registers that one guild will come along, 1 month with a set of ordinances, and then their rival guild will come along the following month and saying, actually, we need to balance the picture here because our members are being disadvantaged by what you've just done last month. So there's a whole set of, and that's why I think this is a period of sort of regulatory construction. You're getting this sort of scaffolding developing, which sort of establishes where those boundaries should lie. But of course, they're being constantly negotiated. And the mayor and aldermen are the people who are supposed to be deciding about this. But it's clearly as much about lobbying as it is about the mayor and aldermen being proactive about it. So it's definitely a dialogue. I think in the 15th century, it moves much more towards a kind of lobbying, petitioning activity. So that's what the guilds are doing in the 15th century. They have particular concerns, whether it's about aliens or another trade, and they'll come to the mayor and alderman with a petition to change their ordinances and have those new clauses adopted and agreed. And again, so it becomes a much more of a sort of fluid environment, I think, where they're responding to particular issues rather than the generality, I think. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Matthew. Allora, nuove domande per Mattia. Thomas.
Now we have the questions for Mattia. Thomas Ertl, please.
Sorry, but this will be my last question for today. The papers were too stimulating. So, it was a great paper. It was convincing somehow and astonishing at the same time. Because what is the aim of the economic aim of a guild? It's to benefit its members, no? And what you showed us is that the cooperation between the government and the guild tried to decrease wages. So are these wage earners not members of the guild? Is this a competition between the guild and people earning wages outside of the guilds, or is this a competition between different guilds? And seems to be rather a complex game, and not only between the government, a cooperation between government and guilds, but between government and guilds on the one side, and who are the others? Maybe not only the wage earners, but guilds as well.
Grazie. Eric Wilhelm.
Yes, and also dovetailing, adding to Thomas's questions about the relationship between guild activities and urban demographic change. What would you say, kind of what are your thoughts and impressions on the relationship between guild activities and kind of how attractive a city is for either a craftsman or someone who is not a guild member, right, to want to move to, in this case, Florence? And then what is that relationship like, say, before and after the Black Death, right? And what you document, those changes to the ordinances. Is the regulatory, labor environment better, do you think, for the representative modal labor or the representative modal, craftsmen? What's attractive for them to move into Florence versus not? So, hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you. Grazie. Patrick Wallace.
So Mattia, great story. The thing that really I'd like to know about, why would these regulations in 1415 work? Okay. There's a lot of institutional changes over many, many decades, but you're saying these ones, they succeed. So what about them? Is it the moment? Is it something about the format that allows them to affect wages and to be used to suppress wages successfully? And do you have, following on from that, evidence that there's suppression of collective bargaining, of collective pursuit of higher wages? Because that seems to be where this might really play out. So that's the...
Grazie. Andrea Caracalli.
Grazie a tutti. E una domanda a Mattia la faccio.
Thank you. A question to Mattia. We'll pose it in Italian. I would like to ask you, so in this picture you described, how would you, let's say, place these elements? Not to weaken your picture, so to say, but to strengthen it, on the contrary. So the first thing is, if I'm not going wrong, the increase in production dispersion in some production phases, and I'm referring to wool production, then the changing in payments, in time payments, and
e quindi come
and hourly payment. So also in terms of salary, how is it calculated and how does it influence it? And then you said there's a decline in the sector, in the industry, right, in the first half of 15th century. We are talking again about wool production. And how do you insert it in a framework of crafts and trades, of merchant entrepreneur who have the interest in decreasing the wages, where, again, collective bargaining of the trades, well, this was banned, this was prohibited. So all these elements, how would you organize them within the picture you described, especially for the wool production, wool processing industry? Thank you. Luis Miguel.
It's a little lateral, but these laws against the peasants going away and going to towns, normally are generally in Europe and are presented after the Black Death. I studied that for Portugal, and first of all, the idea I had, those were laws demanded by the lords independently of the Black Death, and in fact had no direct relation with the Black Death. And I don't think these laws had any effect at all. I don't see how they could prevent peasants from going away.
Grazie. Paolo Nanni.
Dunque, mi sembra molto opportuna la riflessione.
So I think it's useful to reflect on the short-term and middle long-term impact after the Black Death. This is very useful because we cannot read the phenomena in their long-term duration, because this way we lose, the most concrete, real moments in life, in everyday's life. And moreover, there's something similar also concerning, agricultural farmers and laborers. So we have seen an impact after the Black Death, exactly because of the impact on labor force. We have seen the reaction or a reply from the society in the middle and long term. So we have this distinction between short and middle long term in the assessment. I think it's very important also because this corresponds to different generations. You have the generation of the survivors of who survived the Black Death. Of course, the next generation lives and experiences a completely different world. So from here, my question. So beyond this kind of resetting of the norm and regulation context, can we study this world of arts and crafts from different perspectives, which we know is quite diversified in itself?
Okay. So many questions, and I hope I will not forget what I had in mind when you were asking the questions. To Thomas, yes, I agree. So it's a complex scenario that I have in mind, and theoretically, hypothetically, I would say it's the guilds that are not cooperating at the beginning, and then there is a sort of cooperation process that is, you can interpret as from bottom up or from the top down, but it sort of would be addressed at helping the guilds to coordinate against manual workers who are not members of the guilds. So that's what I have in mind. So it's mostly guilds versus manual workers, but in the first time, if you think about, so I'm an economist, so I'm admitting my limitations here, but theoretically, if you think about guilds regulating their own sector independently, you might always think of a fallback position in a condition of labor scarcity for the manual workers. So they can go to another guild. If there is labor scarcity, guilds will compete for scarce labor. So in other words, it's a guilds against guilds at the beginnings, and then it becomes the government that helps to move this action of guilds against manual workers. But then I have to see whether this exists, but that's what I have in mind. And what I'm finding is that effectively the government tries to coordinate. So maybe it's my interpretation, maybe it's not, but it's trying to help them to coordinate. So that's first question. How attractive is the urban environment when there is this demographic change? So it is very much attractive, I would say, and that's what we see. There's a lot of migration, urban migration, and there are norms that tend to attract workers qualified and to limit at the beginning to limit migration from outside, from the unqualified, and then this changes because they see that this is increasing the labor cost too much. So this, I would say, that the urban economic environment remains attractive. Then there is a shift from wool to silk that happens throughout the 15th century, and this also is pushing. There's a pushing tendency for having more silk qualified workers in the city. Sorry. And then Patrick. I don't have evidence of suppression of collective bargaining. That's my answer. I don't think that, as Andrea has said, there's not collective bargaining. But I remember from Franco that there is a fragmentation in bargaining in the 15th century. And so that I would take this as a starting point to see that if the entrepreneurs are facilitated in their capability in their ability to contract individually with people, that would decrease the power. And this goes to the question of Andrea. Can I answer in English? Sorry. Okay. So I will just give you some ideas. So regarding the dispersion of production and the change from time to piece rate, I think they are related with the attempt of decreasing the bargaining power. Because so think about from time to piece rate. From time to piece rate, you have to pay workers. I mean, basically, this is the linking compensation from labor scarcity, right? Because in a way, you have to perform this job no matter how long it takes. Instead, if I'm paying you by time, then you are the powerful in the relationship. So I think these are all things that go in the direction, and these are all changes that happen since the end of the 14th century and the beginning of the 15th century. So, yeah. Maybe I gave you some idea. And also the dispersion of production. I mean, if you don't keep the workers together, then you are decreasing their capability of organizing themselves, like the chompi versus like the centralized production that takes place again during the 15th century. So all of these changes are pieces of a sort of like a jigsaw that I see that we can put together. And I'm trying to, so maybe I'm forcing this interpretation, but I'm trying to see, I'm getting convinced that there is an action from the top that is moving towards this type of tendency. Luis Miguel? Yeah, so I agree. So that's also what Sam Cohn says about the laws against laboratores. What I am interested here is not necessarily the limitation of the possibility of those workers to move to the city. There are two things that are different in the 1415, I think, with respect to the contra laboratores, which is one, we want to know who they are. So we want a list from each community. I don't know whether then they actually submitted those lists, but they want a list. So they want to know who they are, how many, and their salaries should also be subjected to this limitation. Again, I don't know how much this is implemented, but it's a matter not just of moving, but of controlling compensation. And Paolo, yeah, I agree. In the short run and the medium term, this is, of course, something that is changing in the perception. I also agree on the consideration that the new generations have a different perception of the environment, and they're actually moving in an environment which is much more uncertain, I would say, because there's a continuous recurrence of plagues over time, which is changing the way in which they contract. In terms of perception, I don't know how to capture this increased uncertainty, but I would say this, from an economic point of view, would increase the interest rate. So how much you discount future, right? So you want to contract as better as possible conditions nowadays, because you're more uncertain about the future. Now you learn that the future can be dangerous or dramatic. So I didn't get the last question, in the sense that if you're asking if I can look at different explanation for this phenomenon, I would say yes. If you're telling to me if I can look at different institutional aspects of the guilds, I do not have an answer. But in terms of alternative explanation, I guess Franco has provided an explanation, which is the wool is declining, silk is improving, and silk characterizes a different type of occupation than wool. So in a way, manual workers are less strong than they were before because you need less workers of that type. And that would be maybe, right? So, but I'm not super convinced about this type of, because to the extent, so because when I studied the occupational structure, I saw that wool remained a strong occupation in the town. And so I think the extent to which a pure mechanical explanation of sectors declining and sector rising would not fully explain the puzzle. Maybe you can explain me more the question later, but I don't know if I answered to the question or.
Vabbè. Grazie Mattia. No, se posso aggiungere qualcosa.
Thank you, Matthias. Well, I would like to add a couple of words. So this system you just depicted, in this context, we need to take into consideration of what Paolo Nani was saying of the short and medium and long-term evolution, because we have said that after the Black Death, the lack or the scarcity of labor, especially in the wool processing industry, was very evident, was very clear. It is demonstrated by several evidences. For example, in the plague of 1363 and 64, it is evidenced in the documents by wool processing companies. So there's a special case in a company which reopened after the Black Death, and we have variations in the wages. And it's very interesting to look at these figures, because they're about the wages of workers, more, let's say, deeply linked to the workshop, and those of temporary workers. And you can see that the workers, the contract workers, workers having contracts with the workshop, they see, well, their wages increased, which is logical in a way. But then in the end of 14th century, beginning of the 15th century, we see a completely different situation, because the wool production industry undergoes a crisis, and, for example, the quantities of the production, the quantities are so let's say that the production decreases more than the labor force decreased. So this changes the situation completely, because the problem for the manufacturer was no more the lack of labor force, but the lack of production, the lack of demand, let's say, a decreased demand. I will not go further in detail in this, but, you know, concerning silk production, we are here in a very different phase, and in a growth phase. So it's true what Mattia was saying. So with the increase in silk production and with the higher specialization, you know, the profile of labor force in these two main fields changes, because again, so non-specialized workers lack an importance, let's say, so their importance decreases, while the importance and the significance of qualified workers increases. And we see then a process of this, an evolution of this in the following years. Now I have a question for Mario before closing our question and answer session. So Mario, at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about this system, which is not that of not a unique cooperative organization, but it is a system of some trades, some crafts, and the silk industry is something we can see starting from the Middle Ages. So in some cities, this system of the unique trade or unique craft develops, where there is a possibility, at least for the most important groups, so spinners, weavers, and then entrepreneurs, to have their own association. But you also talked about a hierarchy. So the association of entrepreneurs, let's say, keeps under control somehow this aspect. So they do have tools to keep a kind of sort of hegemony. We see this also in other cities, like Lucca, for example, right? Another question, or maybe an insight? I forgot it, actually, but I noted it down here. Let me check. Yes. It's concerning the association of weavers, of spinners. They were in 1737. They asked for an acknowledgement, and this becomes then a tool for them to have more rights and to be, recognized. Well, this is also a story we have already seen, also in modern era. So we have also a brotherhood, so a kind of non-cooperative organizations become something similar to a trade, to a craft, to a corporation. Well, thank you for all your questions, because in replying to your questions, I will integrate the part I could not, include in my presentation. So in Piedmont, in the 60 years of the 1600, the silk spinner arrives. So the workers who work manually in the city and also in the countryside afterwards, they in the loom, spinning looms. So this is a gap. So the spinning loom comes into use. So we have a first presence of the town spinner who have this tool, this kind of, it's a production and entrepreneurial tool. So this influences on the other side we have the importance of the corporations, the importance of the university, which then transforms to a confraternity, but it is a university. So I think words are very much important, and I think it's important to to examine this. About silk stocking manufacturer, we are in a very similar situation. They are founding a university of the workers in this industry. So it is not a corporation, it is not a company, it is a university. So again, the use of this term, so they are recognized by the royal powers, by the royal authority. They are a stable body, so to say, until Chapelier and Napoleon. And they are then, they're born again after that year. So essentially, we are in a time period where there's a kind of We have a common aim for the rights of, for the workers' rights, for example, which goes beyond, social assistance in Middle Ages and in modern era. Because essentially there is a professional interest which is showed in the same moment in which the state recognizes it. So we have the acknowledgement from the state. So more researches are in progress. But in terms of crafts and trades, so it is not applicable to all trades, but we do have a kind of common aim and a common response to the, entrepreneurial dynamics of the time. Thank you. Thank you all the speakers. Thanks to the audience. We can now close our session. Goodbye, good evening, and see you tomorrow.